Oops. Hi, everybody. It's 1 o'clock. We'll get started. Thank you for coming today. We have a lot of work to do this meeting. And so Ashley, if you could move the slide. Thank you. Welcome. So please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Give your name, your title, any affiliation, and then we'll have a good idea of who is here, especially for those who might be here for the first time. Next slide, thanks. So again, we're getting a little bit looser about what we use the chat for, but please still use it primarily for introductions, links, and technical issues. It's kind of hard to follow both the chat and the meeting at one time. Please turn on your camera when you speak so we can get used to knowing who each other is. Next. And I will turn it over to Sadie. You're here, correct? To talk about the survey subgroup and the end user survey that's out. Sadie was here.
Yeah, I'm not sure she's here right now. I don't see her in the list.
Okay, well, I'll start then, I guess. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so as you know, we had a survey subgroup set up. There are about a half a dozen people in it. We've met 4 times in the last month, practically once a week, to create, critique, and edit the questions in the format. It was a lot of work, but it got done, and we emailed it on August 14th. You all should have gotten a copy. It went out to over 1,000 people and probably a few hundred on 3 more listservs. And we've set the deadline for responses on Friday the 25th. We may let it go a couple days longer through the weekend. So if you don't get it done by then, or if you're sending it to people at the very last minute, I think they can answer through the weekend. And Trisha, did you have anything you wanted to add? Or Sadie, if you're here now?
I just saw Sadie in the Teams meeting.
I just told Sadie to come to this meeting. Okay, so
I don't think I see Trisha either, so here we are.
Okay, so I think that's the high-level overview. Does anybody have any questions or comments? We've gotten a lot of responses in the last 2 days, over 100 responses, so that is really good. And again, if you think there's somebody that should be asked to do this, you can either check with us if we sent it to them, or if not, just go ahead and send it to them again and ask them to fill it out. And these would be people who we think will actually use this risk assessment tool when we're finished with it. Okay, so Chris, you're on.
Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next little while is brainstorm with you to learn more about what your impressions were of the tools that you reviewed. And then we're going to launch into a discussion of the pros and cons of those tools, and then another second discussion of what you'd like to see carried forward into our tool. I'm going to use the whiteboard function on Zoom. I tested it yesterday, but it's the first time I've used it, so we'll see how it goes. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so we asked you can go ahead, keep it on that one. We asked you to review a bunch of slides a bunch of sites that are commonly used to do risk assessments in the state of Oregon. And we also asked if you have your own places that you go, that you take a look at those. So the instruction said, didn't expect that everyone would review all of the sites because there are a lot of them. But these are the ones that we put out there. And if we go to the next slide, we provided a bunch of questions. Well, things got a little out of order. Okay, we provided a bunch of questions about what we wanted you to look at or think about when you were looking at these. So I'm not going to go through these questions. Those are there for your notes and for me to parse out later. But what I want to do now is go to the whiteboard and facilitate a discussion. This is what it's going to look like. Facilitate a discussion about what the pros and cons were of the sites that you looked at high level. I don't need to know exactly what site it was. Okay, can you all see that? Yes, no, yes, okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
anybody can go onto the whiteboard and put pros and cons in there. You can just type in there, but if you want me to type, I can do that too. So if you're more comfortable just talking. So yeah, if the way this thing works is it's kind of like the other boards you've seen. You can just type in the boxes and make new boxes and so on. So let's start with just high-level overview. What were some of the things that you liked about the sites that you reviewed? Anyone? Wide range. Yep.
I can jump in and say the MIT stress tool that I've been looking at is very easy to use, very user friendly. It looks really clean. That's what I liked about it.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Anything else?
It's hard to gauge ease to use because it so much depends on just overall
Yeah.
comfort with whatever it is the tool presents. So it's really hard to gauge, especially if you're trying to assess someone with far better GIS skills than mine,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
most people.
Or alternatively, if you have more GIS skills than the average person, you may get confused by the simplicity. So any other pros or cons or?
This is a minor one on CMRA.
Mm-hmm.
The real-time hazard information doesn't really do anything. I mean, you can get that elsewhere, but I didn't do a comprehensive check, but I don't think the others actually give you future modeling results for the 5 hazards that it projects. I mean, it's really broad. It gives you ranges. It's not something you'd want to tie a specific planning scenario to, but I don't think the others give you that degree of projection that far out in the future with a range. And if you're looking at those climate-related hazards, I think that's the principal value of the tool. Otherwise, that may be the only significant value of the tool, actually.
Right. So that the forward-looking.
Yeah, based on the IPCC and national climate assessment scenarios. So for those 5 hazards.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of have a comment about.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a comment mostly about the National Risk Index from FEMA, but it could be broadly applied. I think that it's a really cool tool. It's kind of there's a lot of actionable things that you can do on the site. There's literally a tab that says take action. You can generate reports. I think that that tool and a lot of other tools also kind of save us the computational burden of like having to arrange a lot of those different data sets. This can kind of be something that we build upon rather than try to recreate is the comments I left.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think another thing with the NRI, I'm not sure if that makes it unique, but FEMA just recently updated it, and they actually laid out, here are the changes we made, getting down to, we changed vulnerability indices. We went from the SOVI to the SVI, but also these are specifically the indicators where we changed for which we changed the weighting.
Right.
And that's a really nice sort of here it is for everybody way of doing it.
I don't know what happened to that box there.
The
Yeah.
NRI also offers like really good technical documentation that I think really helps put together kind of like how the data is talking to each other. And there's a degree of familiarity that like maybe like some people can find more power, but from like a new user's perspective, I think it explains a lot of things really well and offers pertinent articles when more specific tasks kind of come up. So it's a really nice tool for that.
Anything that people found disconcerting or that they didn't like in the sites they looked at?
The RISE, I think was it the RISE? Yeah, the RISE impact tool. Well, I mean, the plus is it's really low tech. I mean, that's an Excel spreadsheet, so you don't need to have any kind of GIS system. And it actually reminded me a lot of the Kaiser Permanente healthcare hazard vulnerability assessment tool. It allows really hyper localized input down to individual addresses. The downside is it requires you to categorize everything in there according to the ASCE 24 standard, which I certainly had to look up.
Yeah.
But if you had people that know that, I mean, it's really good for a very, very localized, even down to the business level.
Yes, that's exactly what that tool was designed to do. So
yeah, and that's again that's pretty similar to the Kaiser tool. It's just that Kaiser was specifically designed for healthcare units, but same idea.
Mm-hmm. But hyperlocal may not be good for planning over large areas.
I had kind of similar concerns with the sea level rise impact tool, where it seems like it would be like a nice intermediate type tool where we can kind of put together some calculations before uploading it into a GIS system, but it kind of requires, or the inputs that you want to get out of it really depend on that data dictionary. And I like that you can kind of add on top of that data dictionary to make things more complicated. But to find any like real use of like comprehensive adaptive capacity metrics and all that kind of stuff, I'm sensing you probably need to have a little bit of proficiency with Excel, which maybe not everybody would have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think another aspect of that one is that because of the intended audience, it's looking at a different type of risk and vulnerability. It's, whether it's for business or healthcare, it's really looking at your vulnerability is probably going to be more of a business interruption, business continuity, as opposed to a more public sector approach where you're looking at critical services or public protection. They're not mutually exclusive, but it's a different purpose with a different audience, and to that extent, there aren't a whole lot of good tools out there for that. It's a niche.
Mm-hmm. That's true. It didn't really talk about injuries and personal health things and what have you.
Yeah, but if you're trying to assess, hey, we have 3 facilities in this area, and assess different vulnerabilities of them, which is pretty common for business continuity planning, or for that matter, COOP. It's pretty well suited for that. And actually, it's probably not a bad COOP tool either for the public sector.
Cool.
Sorry, continuity of operations planning.
Yeah.
Another one that really varies across the board is the drill down ability. I think Zachary was talking about, NRI just lets you do all sorts of stuff, which is how it's designed. Some of them really, they stop at the county level and that's it, like CMRA. So if you're trying to get below the county level, it's gonna be better or worse. The other aspect, regardless of the tool, well, I shouldn't say regardless, but even if you can drill down to census tract or census block, the ability to incorporate sub-block information, whether it's specific building information or deed registries for occupancy or dosimetric mapping for where people actually are, all that stuff is that's going to be probably more determined by the capabilities of the user than anything else. But it's tough to assess, but it's worth noting.
Yeah, there's a balance there, and the fire mapping round 1 brought that out, where sometimes you don't want people to drill down too deeply because the data doesn't support it, and other times you might want to, and that's where a tool like the sea level rise spreadsheet comes in, where the point was to drill down deep. So
yeah, or some like the DOGAMI, the Oregon hazards, that's a really useful hazards overlay for whatever else you're doing, and I think that's the main benefit. But it's not a standalone tool. I think it just helps you augment whatever you're doing, whether it's mapping or planning.
I see people are still writing stuff down. This is great. Very helpful. Anything else that folks want to mention? So one of the things that I liked about one of the tools, the MIT tool, in particular, was the fact that you could get to the source data and the source documentation very easily.
Yeah, and the INCORE actually that's real modeling. So, I mean, you have to have access, which I did not try to get, but and I'm sorry, I'm doing the talking rather than writing because my cursor is just being really slow.
No, that's okay.
But most of these tools may give you some modeling output like the CMRA, but the INCORE really, it kind of lets you develop your own. To me, that's sort of, if you really want to get into that, that's one plus that does that the others don't.
So that allows you to play with some scenarios that you can't do with the other ones.
Yep.
I like to kind of stumbling into some of the tools, seeing kind of collaborative work groups forming. I guess it just gives me a better sense of reliability of the data I'm looking at when I know that there's nerds who are kind of like discussing and going over the validity of the data that's going in. And yeah, that collaborative aspect jumped out as a pro for me.
in a particular tool?
In the NRA or NRI tool in particular, some of the other tools I saw different kinds of tabs about collaboration, or where like users could be participating. And then I kind of wondered, some people will get a lot of use out of for the NRI tool. A lot of emergency managers could get a lot of use out of it because they're kind of contextualized to the work that might be involved. But even like a layman user for the NRI tool, there seems like there's a sense of participation that they could be offering, and they have that like take action tab. They have a link to the collaborative work groups and how to get involved with them.
Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the MIT tool, the stress tool also, I think that's the most customizable as far as social vulnerability. I mean, you really can get into the details in terms of selecting your indicators. I mean, you still have to understand the indicators, but
Mm-hmm.
that's about as customizable as I saw for that aspect of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you don't really understand what you're looking at and don't know why you're doing the customization, that could be a problem. But if you want and understand what you're doing, that could be a good thing.
Yeah, although if you don't really know what you're looking at, you're probably not going to take the extra steps.
That's true.
And I'd say that's a hazard for, all of these. It's probably one of the biggest downfalls of the whole SVI approach to begin with. It's like, well, here it is, here are the numbers, and don't worry about it.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, I've looked at numerous indexes over the last 6 months, and my number one complaint is that they just give you an answer. And they don't, most of them, almost all of them, don't allow you to unpack the index. And I think that is a problem.
I think emergency management and public safety are the same thing. We use indicators without validating them at all. I mean, even something as simple as response time.
Mm-hmm.
We can measure it, so might as well use it.
Yeah, the other thing I've noticed as I've looked at these various indexes and I've mapped them on a GIS is they give you different answers. And you really need to understand the assumptions and the purpose of the index to use the answer that it gives you.
So all of what you guys were just discussing could apply not just to the MIT stress tool, but also to NCORE, correct? As far as customization?
I would assume I didn't get into NCORE.
Okay.
I didn't try to set up an account, but it looks like, since that's an actual modeling tool, that's probably you probably have the most, the greatest degree of, I guess, user specification for how you're going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for this exercise, oh, go ahead.
No, it's kind of like Fleet, which is a different type of modeling tool. It's for, trying to do evacuation planning, but you can, there are so many different ways you can customize output and modify your assumptions. So you're not set with like X number of people per vehicle as a set model, or, a single type of, I guess, road structure, road system. If you have the ability to use it, it's nice to have, and it's also a tool that lets you do it easily. It is a big bonus. I have no idea whether NCORE is easy to use. My guess is it expertise.
Mm-hmm. Or training. The training element is important for
Yep.
me because if we have to do a lot of training to make the portal useful, then it takes time that we may not have. So we have to be aware of that. Anything else?
For the climate mapping for resilience and adaptation tool,
Mhm.
it looks like
Mhm.
when you kind of drill down, I'm looking at like Salem right
Mhm.
now, and then there's a link that says 34.6% of population in disadvantaged communities. And so it makes me wonder what disadvantage means. And that looks
Mm.
like it links to climate and economic justice screening tool, which explains the methodology and the categories of burdens. It notes climate change, energy, health, housing, legacy pollution,
Mhm.
transportation, water waste, and workforce development. That seems like a low number of categories for that big of a thing
Mhm.
that's examining what communities are advantaged or disadvantaged. I kind of ran into the same sort of thing with the sea level rise, and that one's really customizable, but like the categories and scoring system that it provides out of the box, it's just like, well, this community is advantaged, this community is not advantaged, but it doesn't specify what that means.
Mhm. So what did folks think about um, some of these sites used other sites and other indices and kind of layered them together? What do folks think about that?
As long as they're clear on their methodology and the weighting, I mean, that's how NRI is set up.
Mhm.
It's just a question of how open and I guess two things: A, how open it is so you can clearly understand this is how it's done, and B, whether it's customizable and you can change the mix.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think it's helpful when you're able to draw on other data that's already established in those other tools. So it would make sense that you could then use some of that data in whatever tool we end up creating and not have to reinvent the wheel on some of that data. But like was mentioned, making sure that it's what we want and it's giving us more pros and cons in regards to how they calculated whatever they did or the data they ended up getting it from to put in their existing platform.
Mhm.
I'm wondering about, I think to circle back to a discussion point from another meeting of how exhaustive do we want those categories to go? To what degree do we have like a comprehensive list, but like what belongs in that comprehensive list for whatever index we're talking about, and what is kind of worth leaving out or inconsequential is something I'm still wondering about.
Yeah. Like, why did they choose those particular categories? Okay, are we ready to move on to the next board? I want to talk about now that we've sort of examined, thought about what it is we liked and didn't like. I want to talk about what we want in our tool. So it's kind of the same exercise, but a little more targeted to thinking about what we want in our tool. So I'll start out. I heard clear definitions. I don't know what this thing's doing. Access to source data. Strategies, adaptation strategies. Yep.
This is not quite a thing to include, and I know no one has a crystal ball, but I guess developing something that you have reasonable confidence can be updated and maintained given the resources typically available to whoever's going to be updating and maintaining. I'd rather have less and have it be updated regularly than have more that becomes obsolete within a year or two because no one has the capacity to keep it up to date.
Yes,
that's a really good point.
Yes.
Can somebody repeat it? Because Erica, you sound kind of fuzzy to me. I think what you were saying was that it's better to have less that you know that you can maintain than to have more that you can't maintain.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So you all probably have some sense, although no one knows with certainty, some sense of what likely can be maintained given typical budgets, workloads, something like that.
Yep. Yeah, so one of my fantasies is that we can draw on web mapping services that are maintained by other people regularly so that we don't have to keep maintaining databases ourselves. Contact us link, very good. Yep. So is there anything that we should definitely try to avoid? I heard in the previous discussion that we want to avoid too much aggregation. And also avoid not being able to drill down into small areas if we or to be forced to use big areas.
I think if you have users can benefit from kind of a deep dive, that's great. It's probably not going to be most of them, but I don't have a problem with offering the capability so much as making sure that it doesn't get in the way of most users. It's kind of like you have a sort of a tiered orientation, maybe a tiered usage as well. So, hey, if you're just trying to do this, here's the equivalent of the Excel spreadsheet. If you're trying to get a little deeper, here's that. If you really want to get hyperlocal, or God, I can't think of the specific tool, but it was one of the ones we reviewed. But if you're trying to do this is probably going to be your, X is probably going to be your best application. If you're trying to do something else, Y is going to be your best application. I've referenced Digital Coast a few times just because they have really good orientations to their tools. They can break it up into small videos, but they can also, it's, I want to do this. It's like, well, this is probably where you're going to want to go. Here are a few options for you.
Yeah, that's great. FAQ, yep. Avoid jargon, yep. So one thing that I want to avoid, and I want your opinion on this, is a lot of particularly the older GIS systems or older portals, the layers are just piled on top of each other and it's kind of left to the user to figure out what it means. I would like something that has more analytical capacity. Does that ring a bell?
I agree with that. I think um, the tool to some degree, like it has the need to give answers, but there should be kind of an option where the answer is more a question mark and there can be more analytical digging or provides that.
Yeah, whoever wrote too much aggregation on not include, I could not second that strongly enough.
Mm.
I think to not include, and this is kind of just describing it vaguely, I was just going to say like too many bells and whistles. The sentiment just behind that is just that we're going to have a necessary amount of parts we need to work with. I think it's already addressed in the scaling comment.
Mm-hmm. Well, also just if you don't want to have so a large toolbox, it's hard for us to maintain.
With
So
that,
even if the data is constant, the software engine might change, and then we'd have to change all our scripts, which is hard to maintain. You should know that as a web developer.
with that comment, Zach, it might be important to be really clear upfront about what this tool can do and what it can't do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if it needs kind of like a certain amount of infrastructure, but like nothing that's too complicated, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
This tool will not make the conclusions that you need to draw for your reporting. You have to actually apply it yourself.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering about like, I guess just the chain of command or the administrative structure underneath it, you know, when it's out there and there's, you know, an owner and then contributors, what that structure kind of looks like and how decisions to edit the tool kind of like go up that chain of command.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. How are we doing on time, Ashley?
We're doing okay. We're only 40
Okay.
minutes in, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been checking also. We have till 2:35 before we have to move on, I think.
Okay.
To
Yeah.
Oh, well, we have lots of time.
Yep.
yeah, to 2:35 and then talk about the work group
Okay,
design.
yeah. So I can talk a little bit about that now and then come back to it. But this information that you're putting here, put in the spreadsheets for the site reviews, will help a smaller work group to design the project essentially. So it's this work that we're doing here is really crucial. It's really, really helpful. Because we can't, whatever small work group does the preliminary conceptual design can't think of everything. So this stuff is super helpful.
Hey, this is Matt Williams from Dagami. I have a question. I had to step away for just a sec, so are we talking about an application for just sort of summarizing the results or like a web tool for people to use, or is this an analysis risk assessment tool that we're talking about?
Well, that's one of the things that we'll have to deal with. My
Okay.
fantasy is that it's more of an analysis tool, but if folks think that's too complicated and we just want to provide an information tool, that's something we need to discuss.
Okay. Well, if it is indeed an analysis tool, I have seen a lot of comments that are like, don't make it too technical, sort of biased towards keeping it real simple. And I am very much a person that likes simple, straightforward stuff. But as someone that has used HASIS a lot, the out of the box, the just sort of just hitting the normal, just the straightforward hitting the buttons, that will give you terrible results. You will not get good results if you do that. So I don't know. I think customizing your analysis to a certain degree is important, and but that requires understanding the tool that we're using, all that stuff. But I just wanted to make a comment because I just saw a lot of stuff like, hey, too many bells and whistles, too technical, that stuff. And again, I think that is I'm in favor of that as well most of the time. But as far as HASIS goes, it's probably you want to avoid that.
Right.
Yeah, if we could just try to avoid the HASIS experience with this tool, I think that would be pretty good by itself. But I mean, I think Matt makes a really good point. I mean, that's one of the inherent conflicts. We're going to have people with a range of skills. Probably the most common user, if you're looking at local emergency management, it's a 1 or 2 person shop with very little direct technical background. If they're lucky, they can use their jurisdiction's GIS, tech, which may also be a 1 person shop. But the flip side is, you can't design to the lowest common denominator. So that's why it's kind of think of a tiered approach. It's don't make the assumption that everyone has the technical expertise, but don't design it for people having no technical expertise. HASIS does have advantages in that, like Matt said, if you customize, if you put in your local soil profiles and you're building information, then it can give you some really useful information as long as you understand that you're still limited by census tracts or blocks, and that may not give you enough. And I would never use HASIS, say, to try to estimate human impact like casualties. It's terrible for that. But I guess I just don't see any way around assuming different levels of both capability and capacity, but mostly capability.
Yeah. So
Matt, I don't know, you said you stepped out for a minute. This is Marion, and maybe you didn't hear this part of the conversation, but I think the piece is about too many bells and whistles, too much to work with, keep it simple. That a lot of that has to do with what it is we have the capacity to maintain.
Oh, right. Yeah. And I did. Yeah, I was there for the comment about that. Yeah. And that's why I said it a couple times. I just want to make it clear. Yeah, I am definitely in favor of, keeping it simple, keeping it, because again, the maintenance burden can be a problem as well. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, totally, Marion. And we're talking about, we're kind of talking about things in a kind of a general way too. It's hard to be specific about something that we're still just sort of trying to,
So one of the things I've been thinking about is within the ArcGIS environment, providing toolboxes that are set up to answer the common questions. So you don't have to go through a big, long analysis exercise yourself. You can hit the toolbox that says, I want to know about, but then that toolbox would be customizable with using drop-down boxes. I don't know if that's possible, but So we still.
Hey, Chris, this is Eric at
Mhm.
OHA. I missed I missed first 10 minutes of the meeting because of call. Anyway, um, so is the tool development uh, going to occur within DLCD or within the participating natural resources agencies, or is this something that's going to be farmed out potentially to one of the academic partners like Oregon Explorer or like the PSU Population Research Center with their tool?
I imagine that it will be a hybrid, but that's one of the decisions we have to make. The other contracting opportunity, of course, is with Esri. But one of the questions that I want to answer in the small work group is, do we have the capacity to serve something up in-house? And the reason is that I had the ulterior motive of wanting to develop expertise within our agencies to build and maintain these types of systems rather than relying on contractors.
Well, I think with the combination of Experience Builder in ArcGIS Online and then the new tool, and I don't want to give too much away, that Esri has developed for ArcGIS Pro 3.1, it's definitely going to make it easier than it would have been a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think that's true. So how do people feel about indexes as a aggregation tool?
Yeah.
Meh.
I mean, there's so many assumptions about smushing everything together. The assumptions about things being linear relations, that things are equal. And I mean, you can weight things, but weighting things usually is it's a value judgment, which is okay, but it's not. So I mean, all these things that are aggregated are sort of, there's no rhyme or reason for it. So I get that people want to look at lots of things and mush them all together, but I think as many other people have said, when you get a number, you tend to have faith in that number. And I think most of the numbers from most indexes are relatively meaningless.
It's letting someone else do your thinking and prioritization for you, which may actually be attractive to a lot of folks. And it's lazy, and the chances that it's going to be accurately reflect your community, unless the tool was developed in your community and uses data only from your community, are pretty small. And I don't think there's a single index that's going to accurately reflect the political aspects. I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm talking about more policy, budget priorities that actually determine a lot of the outcomes and so-called resilience measures. There's actually just a really good paper that came out on that. Yeah, not a fan.
Yeah, I would love to see that paper.
I will send it.
Thank you.
Just got it from the author. You know, the other piece of the indices is, it's like if you're just doing a basic HVA, you're assigning scores and weighting, and you're coming up with numbers. But the sole purpose of the numbers is simply for prioritization. You're ranking. The numbers themselves don't matter. So if you're using indices just as part of your prioritization tool, I think they can be useful if you understand how they're put together and they assess the indicators that you think are valid, assuming you put in that effort. But as a standalone tool, it's like using an HVA as well. This is the means to an end. We get this number and we do everything we can to get the numbers to come out the way we want to.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you. I took some indexes that were other people did, and I turned the scores into Z-scores so that I could see the ranking, and turned out to be way more useful. I'm not sure it was totally statistically correct, but the point is ranking and not the number is really important to me. Because a percentile, yeah.
Please finish, Sarah.
Go ahead.
I guess the other thing I often don't see in indexes is looking at whether the components of the index are correlated. And so looking at whether the components of the index are correlated.
Yeah.
I don't think that's often done. So, I mean, even the sort of rankings, I mean, let's say there's an index with 12 things and they're all mushed together. If they're pretty tightly correlated, you could look at, if most of those things are tightly correlated, you could look at 2 things instead of 12 things.
Yeah.
And I guess, if you would probably get the same ranks if you looked at many fewer components of the index. So I guess what are the components that one might put into an index that would provide the most informative ranking for a particular purpose? And I think that you could often get to that point without mushing 12 things together into an index.
Yeah, I agree. If you look at, Susan Cutter, who's been, she came up with SOVI, or one of the people who came up with SOVI. She was writing about resilient, trying to assess resilience. Granted, not quite the same as risk, but it was okay. Well, for whom, it's what you're coming out with. Either the number is going to mean different things to different people, or the result that you need is going to vary by your application, which makes using an inflexible tool that someone else has selected just really problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Chris, I
Yes.
actually fall in the camp of in being in support of an index. And, it's just having that visual perspective and being able to look at communities that, you may want to keep an eye on and, that could be affected tremendously by, multiple natural hazards. I mean, it's just a good way to be able to, for like the legislature and the governor to keep an eye on particular areas around the state, and I'm not just saying that because I'm currently working on an index either. And I fully agree with Erica. I mean, one of the first steps in this is, once the data is collected, is to do a principal components analysis of the data, because you don't want to start unintentionally adding additional weight when you've got indicators that are highly correlated.
Right, exactly.
Yes. So Eric, I think it's a reasonable point. I guess my concern is that as soon as you start using that as a reference, you have to worry about, anchoring bias. It's like, okay, there's our number, or, it starts to dominate, and it becomes the end rather than a tool. And I think that's one of the big challenges with indices in general, or, for that matter, you could make the same argument for HVAs, but I don't see how you get past that. If you're designing your own index for whatever your area, whether it's a county or region or a state, and you put thought into what the components are and how they're going to be used and weighted, that's great. I think that's different from using someone else's semi-standardized tool. If you look at all the different indices that are out there, there's not a whole lot of consistency, and I think it's a big part. I mean, we're not using the same benchmarks. So, make a customizable tool that is designed for your jurisdiction or area of interest. Great. Then you still worry about anchoring bias, but at least you know that it has some likelihood of validity for what you're trying to apply it to.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And you know, inevitably there will be agencies that will want to use whatever index is built for infrastructure investments, you know, and so I would assume careful guidance would want to be um, a company who'd want to accompany the index that's built. And yeah, I mean, to your, you know, to your point about like out of the box indexes, I think a great example of that is the Environmental Justice Index that ATSDR and CDC, well, CDC, one and the same, bill, where, you know, since it's a national tool, and, you know, Chris has addressed this issue a few different ways, that, you know, comparing a census tract in Oregon to a census tract in the South, you know, creates some problems. And so like just one of the pieces that will need to be figured out in building the index is going to be, you know, whether census tracts are compared across the state or whether they're broken up into regions.
And to what degree we can get below the census tract level.
Yeah, Portland State has come up with has been discussing ways to identify, well, to include reliability of the data, you know, because, you know, obviously people want things to be as granular as possible. So, you know, they gravitate to census block groups, you know, which can be a problem because unreliable data can be really misleading.
Yeah, and just I mean, again, you have the aggregation problem with sparsely populated county, you know, versus a tract versus say an urban core. And obviously, there are going to be a lot more people in the latter than the former, but both in neither of them are they likely to be, I guess, accurately displayed in terms of where the humans actually are, particularly at different times of day. I mean, that's one of the big problems, especially for the coastal hazards. You know, that whether it's data spectrum mapping or if I'm saying right, or something else, some other tool that actually shows where the people are and seeing how much of a difference that is in terms of actual vulnerability or just exposure relative to the homogenization inherent in any census data.
Yeah, census tracts don't respect neighborhood boundaries. So you can have a census tract that homogenizes over even a small area, but that small area might be very diverse. I live in a census tract like that, where you go 2 blocks away and it's a whole different neighborhood, although we're in the same census tract.
Yeah, when I took my original TASIS training, which was a really long time ago, I think we used Tillamook County because they had so few census tracts, you know, to play with it. And it's like, wow, well, there's an enormous amount of ground covered in there. And, you know, just something as simple as, okay, how many people are actually in this area? Where are they relative to their travel distance or their direct exposure? And just, you know, you're always going to have that limitation with if you're just doing standardized census data.
Yep.
There's always the option to include multiple geography scales. So county tract, block group, county subdivisions as well. Those work really well in rural areas, you know, like places like Sherman County where the whole county is a tract. And, you know, data goes back 60 years for those subdivisions don't change.
What are they called?
Census county subdivisions.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't work particularly well in urban areas, but in some respects work better in rural areas.
Great. Wow, lots of good information here and thoughts to think about. Anything else that we need to think about avoiding? Anyone have any?
I guess I don't know. Ideally, we'd want all the native resolution of all of the data to be at the same. The native resolution of all of the data to be the same, or for it to be plausible to aggregate the data without creating a lot of uncertainty, or if the data for some variables had to be subdivided for a particular resolution, then that, I guess, just thinking about what's the native resolution of the data, because you can get into trouble if it's not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and mentioning that, Chris, we're not going to be able to provide any human health data below the tract level.
Right. And a lot of data is not available below the county level for a lot of these metrics or indicators. So how do you deal with that? So one of the things I did with an index I've been working with called the Climate Vulnerability Index, which has a ridiculous number of indicators, is I took the groups, what they call the dimensions, and got the original data, which took forever to find it. And then I was able to do to look at what is driving each of those dimensions using spark lines. So it allows you to sort of ignore a bunch of the indicators within the dimension and focus in on the thing that's really driving the dimension. It worked sometimes, but sometimes all of the indicators were pretty much the same, and so it's hard to differentiate. But that's the kind of thing I mean by providing analytical tools to help dig into the data a little bit to understand what's behind the curtain.
One possibility on the resolution, I don't know how feasible this is ultimately, but would be within whatever is built to allow aggregation where reasonable, but not to allow disaggregation. So I mean, if data are available at the county level, not basically, I mean, people can do whatever they want if they want to extract the values, but within the tool itself, to not enable people to assume that the county level value is applicable to all of the tracts, or if it's not possible to do something with the tracts that reliably allows aggregation to the county, but basically to kind of wire into this tool what is and is not sensible to do with the data. Again, recognizing people can extract the data and do whatever they want with it, but making it so that within the tool itself, there's some control over what can be done at what level. And maybe if there's, again, I'm just totally, you know, in a universe where everything is feasible, if there's a county level option and there's a tract level option, maybe some data are available at both levels, if that's how the data are provided by the original source, or maybe some things still are available for counties and not for tracts, and vice versa.
Okay, have we spent enough time on this?
I have one last question, Chris.
Okay, yeah.
And this question really is just a reflection more of my ignorance, but hoping somebody has the answer to it. Without an independent variable, aren't you kind of like when you're starting to think about weighting, aren't you really more or less confined to either equal weighting or some kind of Delphi or mini Delphi method?
I don't know. I don't know how to summarize what you just said.
I interpreted that as maybe unclear parameters, like establishing what exactly is our independent variable. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was getting at with that.
Okay.
Is you know, I don't. Yeah, like I don't know what that would be.
Right, like being like vulnerability is a function of.
Okay.
And then you wouldn't weight the entire vulnerability. You would weight only the individual components of the vulnerability equation.
I think we'll have to come back to that.
That's going to be an exciting conversation.
Are there any, like, as I started to do here, just notes that are not, you know, pros and cons, but there is a little bit of mixing up going on here, but some last thoughts just about the whole what you'd like to see in the design or not, or what we need to think about.
One thing that I was thinking about for pro indexes, and maybe a lot of indexes, is that there's some level of comparison or standard deviation between different metrics that one tool is pushing out versus another. And so if that's factored in, that in some way can tell us a little bit about reliability. But, you know, in that we're kind of creating that mechanism, we're already applying our own bias to it. So there's complicatedness there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that we need to pay attention to, is the range and the values. And what's one of the things I was thinking about too is it possible to create an index that has a range of values? And we may find, if we can do that, that the range is so big it's not useful. To avoid that anchoring and giving, you know, the sense of having the answer. All right. Well, this has been really great, and it's given us a lot of information to sort through and help get us started. So for the remainder of this meeting, these whiteboards are open, and you can go in there and edit them to add stuff as you think of it. So I think, do we feel like it's time to move on and talk about what we're going to do with this information that we just collected?
So at this point, we're not summarizing this information or coming to any kind of agreement on what the pros and cons are, what we want to include or exclude, right?
No, we're not doing any of that yet. This was a big group exercise. So we can bring up the PowerPoint, and I want to describe a little bit of what I have in mind for the next steps. So let's go up a little bit. I think there's a slide that talks about the work group. Maybe it didn't get in there. Okay, so what we're going to do next with all this information, I guess I didn't put a slide in, I should have, is over the next month or so, I want to assemble, and sooner rather than later, assemble a small work group to assimilate this information that we've collected over these last 9 meetings, and to work together to create a very broad, what I'm calling a storyboard of what a system would look like. So what I mean by that is we would put ourselves in the position of the user, and we'll get information from the surveys as well. And we'll think about, they're sitting at their computer, maybe by themselves, maybe in a group, and what screens and tools and questions would come up and how that would link together into a whole system. And I'm not talking right now about getting into the details of what the tools are, but more just the functionality. How do we want this system to function for the user? And what so that is my next step, is to assemble a small work group. And some of you have already told me you'd be interested in being in that group. And if you are, you now know you're interested, if you could put something in the chat, that would be helpful. So yeah, so the next step is to take all this information and do a conceptual site, I guess. Does anyone have any questions about that? And then after that, after we do sort of the grand vision, then I'm going to want to break it up into parts, and then the smaller groups will work on the individual parts to articulate what those would look like. Then we can make a decision about whether we want to try and do this in-house or whether we require outside expertise. And it must be, it feels a little daunting right now, but I think we can do this together to at least get to a point where we can tell someone on our elevator speech what it is we're trying to do and how we want it to work. So those are the next steps. See, I already see a few volunteers. That's great. So I will be sending around doodle polls to do at least 4 meetings over the next 4 to 6 weeks to do the big picture development. So along those lines, and because we did talk about indexes, and I think it's almost inevitable that indexing will be included in the system one way or another. Esri came out with a technical white paper that describes creating composite indices. And part of the reason for them doing the white paper is that the new version of ArcGIS Pro has a tool for creating indexes. And so they wanted to provide basic information about the pros and cons and pitfalls and what have you of developing indexes. It's a nice, easy to read paper. It doesn't go too deep into the weeds. If you want to go deep in the weeds, there's extra reading at the back of the paper. And I think that for the purposes of our future conversations, it would be worthwhile everyone at least skimming over this paper. So after this smaller work group comes up with the big vision, then we will come back to you, the bigger group, and share it and have another conversation about whether we are ready to move forward or we still need more refinement, or how we might break ourselves up into small groups to work on the pieces. So, do you have anything to add there, Marion?
Yes, this would be a good time to talk about the
yes. This slide. So as you're reading the paper, think about the risk equation and how the elements of the risk equation might be articulated into what the Esri paper calls dimensions. The dimensions being the characteristics of the hazard, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So as I was reading the paper, this is sort of how I started to think about things. And it doesn't mean that we have to put everything in an index. It's just my thinking about the terminology in the paper and its relationship to the risk equation. So Eric says we're turning the Esri best practices into a presentation for. So can you say more about what you mean? Or
yeah, there's just some key components that are called out in the best practices, and so we're taking those key components and we're matching them up with different aspects of some environmental justice indexes. We're going to be looking beyond just EJ indexes as well, just so that our team and the EJ Council can get a better understanding.
That's great.
For the whole index development process.
That's wonderful. I think that'll be really helpful. So yeah, just something to think about. So so the next steps, as I mentioned, will be to put together the small work group and then develop something to present to the larger group in the next meeting.
Chris, this would also be a good time to talk about the log sheet, the capacity sheet.
Oh yes, actually,
declarations.
Okay, so I guess I should have put something in there about that too. Okay, so way at the beginning of this process, we put out some log sheets to help us understand what capacity and expertise each of the agencies participating in this project have. It would be really helpful to go into the box and fill those out so that we understand who has what, who knows what your capacity and is to participate and what kind of data you have, so that we know what we can draw on locally in the state of Oregon.
Yes, and I think in the last 1, 2, or 3 emails you got has links to those. I'm going to call them log sheets. One is about the capacity and expertise you have for doing analysis in a GIS environment, in particular ArcGIS Pro. One of them is about losses that your agency has sustained due to natural hazards and potentially dam breaches. And the other is about any mitigation actions that you're working on now for natural hazards. But the most important one for right now, if you only have time to do one, is the one about the capacity for analysis. And I think you can see why. We cannot do this ourselves, as you can tell. We need all of you, all of your brains, and all of your capacity at the table. And to see, like we called this a work group because we need you to help us do the work. And so this is a very serious ask. And it will lead to the declarations of collaboration or some fairly formal agreement of what you and your agency can do to help us move this forward.
That's right. So at the beginning of the project also, we did talk about our desire to develop declarations of collaboration with each of our participating agencies. And these are modeled on Oregon Solutions process. And the purpose of the declaration of collaboration is for us to understand what resources are being made available to us to do this project. And if we need to, it will help us understand whether we need to bring in outside expertise and where we need to do that. But also it's a way to ensure accountability and that we all understand what each of us is committed to do in support of this project. So that is one of our other next steps in the next month or so will be to introduce those declarations of collaboration in a boilerplate format, and then also to tailor them for each of your organizations. And hopefully you can get your upper management to sign off on these so that we have strong interagency support. We know who is committing to what and how deep.
And in Box, you can go back to meeting 1 or meeting 2, and you'll find the declaration of collaborations that we had put out there, an example. So you can start to get familiar with that and think about it.
Mm-hmm. Any questions about the next steps? And I wish we had a different slide up. Do we have a next step slide? Well, there's talking about the design work group. Yeah.
We have a homework slide.
Yeah. Anyway, so do people have any questions about the next steps?
I was wondering about, so for the design group, it was great to talk with you. I believe it was 2 weeks ago about this. And I guess when I think of system design, I think all inclusive, like the front end of the application and the back end. Would the design group more so be looking at the front end, or would it be kind of in that all inclusive, like where it plugs into the back end and speaks to it? Is that the level of kind of where we're going to be looking at it, or is it going to be mostly on the superficial end?
I wouldn't call it superficial, but yes, more on the big picture end. I don't think, well, I don't want to start talking about data and sources of data and all that, where it lives and all that kind of thing. I really want to focus the design group on functionality. What functions do we want to provide in this system?
Superficial is not always a nice word.
Because what functions we want and will drive what data we need and what the back end looks like. Gotcha. The behind the screen. So I really want to focus on the functionality. What functions do we want to provide? And again, being mindful of the idea that we don't want to bite off more than we can chew in round 1 here. So we'll talk about things like scale. How deep do we want users to be able to drill down? That kind of thing. What tools we might want to provide. Yeah. And, big questions like, do we want to use the risk equation as an organizing principle, or is there something else we want to use as an organizing principle? Are there bits of the risk equation that are missing, such as mitigation, natural hazard mitigation projects that have taken place in the past, those kinds of things. Yep. So focus on functionality. Okay. So are there people from the community outside of state agencies that want to comment on this project and our vision at this stage, or make us aware of something you want to make sure gets included in our thought process?
Or do you have some capacity you'd like to lend to the process?
Yeah. I'm just looking through the people that are on. I don't see members of the public.
Oh, you mean in who's online?
Yeah.
Well, we can ask that question. We have a slide.
Yep. Now's the time to speak up.
Kevin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I didn't see you in the chat. Can you tell me what agency or organization you're with?
Okay.
Okay.
All righty. So I am happy to talk with any of you individually. As Zach mentioned, he did reach out to me to get sort of caught up on some background stuff, and I was happy to come over and talk to him. I'm hoping that these next small group meetings to talk about the big picture can be done in person or maybe hybrid, because I think it would be really helpful to be able to use a piece of butcher paper and bat things around. So yeah, stay tuned for those invitations or Zoom. Those meeting
Doodle.
scheduler. Yeah, Doodles. That's the one. Yes. Okay. Any last words? Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for your participation, and I really value your opinions and insights, and I'm sure they'll all make it into our big picture. So we'll report back on September 6th with some sort of partial, probably big picture ideas.
Nice job with whiteboard.